And so welcome to part 3 of Competitive Intelligence Practices, What's on Your Mind. And I just want to provide a bit of an intro to this. For some of you, you're veterans of this by this third part. But we started 3 months ago in August with the first part, and it was such a hit that questions kept rolling in that we just didn't have enough time to address all of them. And so we've expanded now to this. Now, this will be treated as the final part, even though we'll likely have more questions to tackle. Because we'll be taking on a different approach with our webinars, actually integrating more of your questions into future webinars. So future webinars will be organized thematically as they had been prior to these 3 parts, but we'll be incorporating more questions that you have on your mind, so that this is something that we'll be basically bringing forward through 2020 and probably beyond. So we really appreciate your enthusiasm and the thoughtful questions that you've shared with us over the course of the past 3 months, and basically helping us shape our programming as well. So thanks very much for that, and that's a little bit of a program note as we proceed. So while this is part 3 and the final part of this series, we will continue to take your questions as we go. And a bit about the Council, for those of you who aren't familiar. We are a not-profit educational organization that's geared to support the profession and professionals who are dedicated to CI. And our roles as ambassadors, champions, mentors, and educators, or ACME, really are a part of our guiding mission. And we are also global, and you'll see the countries listed here, from Argentina to the UK and the US. And so is our audience, and so we're really grateful for this. I'm the head of the Council of Competitive Intelligence Fellows, and I'm joined today by Craig Fleisher, who is the Vice President of the Council of Competitive Intelligence Fellows, waving there, and Cliff Kalb, who is actually a past president of the CI Fellows in a different incarnation. And we also have slated a couple of other fellows who are geared to join us, and so we may see them appear. And so as we do, we'll just provide you a quick overview of what we covered in August. For those of you who missed it, these are recordings that are available. And so the August recording is available. The September recording will be uploaded shortly. But in August, we covered foresight, skill sets, and CI. Also, the question is, how to tell whether or not a job advertisement is actually CI related if it doesn't include CI or the word intelligence. And then tackling the big question of CI during mergers and reorgs, and how to manage the change and how to pivot as your organization is evolving as well through that process, and then managing expectations for faster, cheaper, and various efficiencies, and then looking out for red flags and pitfalls so that you can be on alert and be able to anticipate and respond. And then what are the signs to look elsewhere for opportunities during these very sometimes sticky processes. And then in September, we talked more about soft skills and managing various personalities in our organization, and then by extension, influencing organizational culture. Then we looked at transforming the behaviors of intelligence program stakeholders, and then making various intelligence outcomes more memorable to them, because oftentimes they've moved on to thinking about something else. So that's also a perennial challenge for us. And then we wrap this up by talking about how to strengthen communication and consulting skills for intelligence, and various recommendations for books. So for today, we've organized our questions again according to themes, and you'll see here we're going to get started by talking about management, and specifically, let's start with question 1, which is, to what extent have practitioners added project plans after their recommendations to show decision makers what could be achieved by when, and when to take advantage of or mitigate the impact of an external event? And so this is really creating more responsiveness and flexibility to an intelligence project. And I just want to note that while we do have CI fellows with us, that many of you are deeply experienced as well in many of the questions that we'll be asking. So I urge you to share your thoughts in the chat, and if it's something more extensive too, I'm more than happy to open the lines up for you as well. And I just want to make a note that we are joined by Eric Johnson, our fellow who is not on the previous list, and so he's been brought forward here on our panel. So who would like to take on this question then about post-project management? Any thoughts about this in your experiences?
Well, I'll jump in if you don't mind. There's a kind of a subtle way of looking at this. It's a very interesting question. I think it comes down to the starting point is whether you view your position as an advisor or as a line manager. And the difference, of course, is that the endpoint for most advisors are recommendations, and the endpoint for most line managers is as taking action and being accountable for profit and loss in a business. So I would say that normally in CI, the endpoint is the recommendation, and then the decision maker can decide whether to accept it in full or in part, or combine it with other things that they get from other advisors, and then they'll take an action. However, if you go across that border and you suggest a plan for how to move forward, it sometimes implies that you would like to have some of the responsibility for the outcome. So I think you have to be careful about this kind of thing in the sense that whether or not you'd like to be measured on the outcome of your recommendations. Mm-hmm. Just a thought.
And Craig, it seems like you have some thoughts as well.
Yeah, so the way that I've kind of communicated this is, there's 4 questions that you could probably ultimately answer with any insight that you generate, and that's the what, the so what, the now what, and then the what then. So for me, one of the things we always do up front in any project is we try to find out just how many of those questions the client needs us to answer. If the what and the so what's enough, that's where you stop. If he needs the now what, or if he needs a contingency analysis, then we can go to those other 2 questions in the back end. But again, like Cliff's talking about, the real question is, how much do you want to be invested in the implementation, if at all? How much do they expect you to be invested in that implementation? And can you get your client interested in moving beyond that as well? And where I'm going with that is, again, some clients, in order to get them invested in that now what and what then questions, or answering those things, it helps to have them involved in those conversations. So this is where we often do a lot of social analytics, things like simulations or war games or alternate futures exercises. If they're in the room with you and having that conversation, it makes it very, very clear, or at least it gives you that opportunity to clarify, just how far does that insight need to be stretched into the implementation phase.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Fantastic. Yeah, and Eric, I see that you are unmuted now, so I think you're prepped to share your thoughts.
Yeah, I'll just share. I had a interesting meeting a couple of days ago with a company that is made up of a bunch of other companies, and they're trying to sort of wrestle with the strategic rationale of why this collection of businesses is together, and then what they do for each other. And somehow we got around to the topic of choices versus decisions. And I really, you may have heard me say this before, I feel pretty strongly about this, that choices are better than decisions are. And I think in relation to a recommendation, if it's an actionable recommendation, it should include options and probable outcomes as hypothesized by the analyst in terms of optimality, and sort of which of those options is regarded as optimal by the analyst. And then the analyst should be prepared to say, why? Here's why I've arrived at this assessment, and be prepared to take ownership of that option. And it goes back to this conversation around choice. And the CEO in this meeting said, that's probably the big thing I took away from that meeting was, I shouldn't think about these as decisions anymore because I hurry and try and, create, morale with my reports by being fast in arriving at which decision and how to approach the decision, when in fact I should be slowing down and making sure I've given each choice a fair consideration before I choose one. Because, and the key to this was, choice implies sacrifice. It's not a choice unless you've sacrificed the suboptimal options that you've been presented with. And you know that you haven't done your due diligence if it's only two choices and you're picking one, because there's always more than two choices in any given situation. And that's really the diligence of an advanced intelligence analyst, someone who's able to say, here are your 10 choices, here are the two that I find most attractive, and this is the one that you should take because X.
Wonderful. And these I think are terrific perspectives. And I'll just add one other thing, and this also references back to Craig, is that when we're talking about situations like this too, when it's, when we're talking about tacking on to a project, post recommendation, often when the situation lends itself, obviously, I think it's really important to look at some type of continuous monitoring, but not in the traditional sense of just tracking a topic, but actually extending it to issue analysis. And issue analysis oftentimes is conducted as a one-off. But when we conduct proper issue analysis, and Craig Fleisher and Babette Ben-Susan in their body of analytic writings actually outlines how to conduct issue analysis very nicely. But when you conduct issue analysis, there is an iterative aspect to this too that helps sharpen the decision makers to that particular issue. It basically keeps that issue surfaced if it's important, and if it isn't important, if it gets demoted, and perhaps another issue then emerges. But when you conduct this, you're basically getting this Gantt chart of various types of issues, that the executives or decision makers need to be focused on. And so I really like that approach if time and resources allow, because it's a wonderful way of keeping an eye on evolving issues towards mitigation, right? If that issue is important enough. So I just want to supplement that recommendation. And we've also developed for dashboards to help with it. And I'm not sure where this audio is coming from. Sorry, I apologize for this. A sec, please, while I try to figure this out. I'm sorry, I'm not quite sure where we're getting this audio issue.
My system says it's Cliff. Sorry, Cliff. Okay, sorry,
you're gone, Cliff. All right. So apologies for that. Until Cliff is ready to talk, you can just wait. And so with this, creating a tool for issue analysis can actually be a wonderful thing, because you can actually create dashboards along with that, and you can create various types of reporting and outputs. And at the SLA conference this past summer, in June, Jen Swanson and I actually did a presentation on an example of this for a project that we had done. So, and that's a fellow that I just referenced as well. So yeah, thanks everybody for for your thoughts on this, and please share follow-up questions too to this if we haven't been clear in any aspects, or if we can elaborate. So now on to question 2. And sometimes this question, I think, gets people shaking their heads, wry smiles, gulping, because of those 3 letters. How do we measure success? ROI, our value, etc. The perennial question. So who wants to take a stab at this?
I'll start this, since it was the topic of my dissertation research, which, by the way, is probably still ongoing. So here's my answer: yes. So we measure success in a variety of ways. And I'm going to take a step back. We need to measure success in most everything we do. And it starts with the planning phase of what we do. Building in a feedback loop, what Cynthia and you and I would talk about is double loop learning, making sure that we have up front a keen understanding of what the client views as success, what we view as success, what the organization views as success. So again, it's going to be a multi-dimensional, multi-level kind of an approach that most of us have to take. But I don't mean to be snarky, but most of the folks that I studied in our field, and that's now well into the, I'm now in my 4th decade of studying this, most of us don't do a very good job of building in those success metrics up front. And until we start to do that and we get agreement on that, this question becomes a bit of it's a bit of a bolt-on. The fact that you actually get asked that question, if someone has to ask us, was it successful or not? Were you successful? What is your ROI? The fact that they're asking tells you that there's at least some miscommunication or misunderstanding about what the value that CI brings in the first place. Relative to the 3 letters, and again, I'm going to be very brief, the 3 letters of ROI, there's been a number of us, including a handful of fellows, that have tried to do that. There are better and worse models of it. Some of these work some of the time. None of them work all of the time, because if they did, we'd all be using them. And again, generally, it's I would argue it's indicative of a failure to communicate, as has been said in a couple of key movies. So having proper communication, building in those metrics up front, getting a keen understanding of what the client actually views as success and what it's going to take to move the organization forward relative to those clients' needs, if they're executive decision members or board members, that's critical. I'll stop there.
I'd like to take a stab at it.
I'm sorry, yes?
Yeah, this is Rich Caldwell. Can I take a stab at it?
Yes, of course, we would love to.
So my industry is a little different. I'm in aerospace defense, and we've struggled this as well. We're part of a larger business development team, and we measure that team's success basically on win rates. Are we winning or not? The problem that I face is, the work that I do could be 2 years out from a bid process. So I'm doing work and shaping 2 years away, and the ROI, the win will come 2 years down the road. How much did I contribute to that? So that's a difficulty that I've been dealing with. So what I've done is, for each step in our processes that we run through, and I run through quite a few. I have about 6 or 7 different things that I do. At the end of that, I send them a survey monkey, specific questions, and I keep it short, because people have a tendency not to do long surveys. And then we feed that back in. And then when I get near the end of my process, I ask them, well, how many of our recommendations, this goes back to your project plans. We don't do project plans. I make recommendations on strategy and positioning and pricing. So I go through and say, how much of this have you used? And where has that changed in your positioning? And that's how I measure my ROI of my team, if we're doing the right things. I do some simple, measures at the end. Did we get the right competitor? Did we get the right solution? Did we get the right cost? Did we understand what the stakeholders were really talking about? But it's difficult in my industry, because we face forward and everything's a bid. Basically, we're looking at a bid, and we look at win rates. So that's basically how we do it.
Wonderful. Thanks, Rich. Appreciate that. Yeah, and if you have any other thoughts about your own approaches to this, but I have to say I wholly agree with both Craig and Rich. I think both of you really emphasize the process as much as the outcome, that relationship and the communication and the engagement. And in the end too, that's often what we remember when we're working with our colleagues as well, and that goes for our decision makers and various stakeholders. And so I think that's an important aspect to emphasize. It's also not just about the returns, but are they thinking about you at their point of need? And so I do appreciate your feedback on this. And I do want to mention, though, and my fellow fellows will know this too, that there are a few folks among us in our community who feel that CI can't be measured. the returns are just cannot be measured. And there is actually a debate within the group, as to whether or not this is possible. And so for those, if I may speak for them, those who feel that it can't be measured feel that they tend to emphasize more of that process and the relationship and the intrinsic value of Intel, as opposed to the actual outcomes, simply because there are too many variables, and oftentimes Rich mentions the cycle that they're working with, because sometimes the cycles are really too long, and for them to really know to know the real outcomes. And so there is this ongoing debate within even among the fellows about whether or not it can be measured, and should be measured as well, because some folks also advocate that you don't even want to go down that path, because it's getting the Intel users and stakeholders focused on the wrong things, or perhaps overly focused on things that they shouldn't be. So plenty of opinions to go around.
Well, can I just let me just add one thing. I think one of the ways to look at it, and I appreciate Rich's comment about the 2 years into the future in his industry. In my industry, which is the pharmaceutical industry, sometimes the decisions are 7 years away, 10 years away, 15 years away, because the drug development cycle is quite long. I think what happens often is, as you're going through the process of conducting the project, at least in my experience, you don't generally work alone. You work as part of a team where a variety of other functions will contribute to the effort. And you may be the chair of the group, or someone else may be a chair of the group. And I think on rare occasions, and rare occasions only, what I used to do is bring in a finance person at the beginning. And that finance person would join the team, and they would make an assessment from the perspective of the corporate culture in which we worked as to whether or not the project plan that we had was measurable by the standards that the company used to measure everything else. So that when we got to the end, the plan for how to measure it was actually proposed by the finance person. And when we got to the end, the finance person would be the person on the team who would offer what the financial results were. So if it looked as if that was where you wanted to go in that culture, it would actually be measured by a person whose job it is to measure things.
Terrific. And I just want to mention that Cliff's talking about the pharma life sciences industry. So very, very long development cycles there. And we do have a fellow Brad Ashton joining us, but he seems to be having some trouble with his audio. So he may be joining us just strictly via chat, and I'll be monitoring that as well. Oops, pardon me. And so let's get on to another sticky question, which is, what are some of the best commercial CI practice groups we can or should benchmark? And that's another loaded one, because there's even debates whether or not one should benchmark against other groups, or whether or not we should really look at our own needs as on their own. So so who wants to take a stab at this? Anyone want to go first? Well, I'll just start by saying that I think I tend to fall in the middle of this debate of whether or not we should benchmark. I think that with benchmarking, it's very easy to become a follower, and it's very easy to misunderstand what it is that we are benchmarking. We may be following an organization and benchmarking towards that when it's not necessarily the right fit for us. So I think it's really important, as we discuss questions like this, that we caveat this by saying that it's important to understand the type of benchmarking that we want to embark on. And And if I remember correctly, there's a really good definition in the Harvard Business Review, and I can follow this up on our LinkedIn group, where Roberto had outlined various types of benchmarking, so that you can understand which is the best path for you, rather than just an apples to apples, or perhaps not quite understanding the various the benchmarking criteria that you should be going after. So in terms of the practice groups too, I also try to stay away from a company and and holding up a company's practice, because I find that there are elements of different teams that I really like, of which I know. And so what I do is I tend to look at those various elements and adopt the ones that fit best for the clients that I'm working with, or perhaps for us, these CI fellows and so forth. And so that's generally the approach that I like to take, rather than just pointing at a particular company. I think people used to point at Steve Jobs and say, well, this is the way to go, right? In terms of managing and point at Jobs' genius. But there are a lot of elements that come into play, that in the success of any particular team or company. So with that, I'll take a step back, because I think, Craig, you've been nodding and you're unmuted, so I'm going to turn this over to you.
Yeah, so I agree with everything you said, by the way, and the reality is it's almost always better if you really feel like you want to benchmark. And I'm not saying you shouldn't do that. Actually, I'm going to say you should do that, but you need to do it at the right level. And the practice level probably is the best place. So when I hear somebody talk about commercial practice groups, obviously that's a lot of practices that come under that umbrella, and you may want to look at one or two of those, but probably not the whole umbrella, because otherwise what you end up doing is you end up trying to bolt in practices from somebody else in a completely different context, as opposed to building it into your own practices and context, which is really what it needs to be done. So I'm going to take a different plane of attack on this one, Cynthia, if you don't mind. There have been two efforts that are published that some of us may be aware of, where people have tried to benchmark CI practice units. One of them was an effort that was done by fellow Jan Herring and a group of us back in the late 1990s and early 2000s. It was a benchmarking effort where we had about 20 to 24 companies we actually did apply a standardized protocol of questions to. We went and interviewed them, and a lot of that was published in the two places. It was published in the CI magazine back in the late 90s was the first publication. The earlier ones were in the early turnaround of Y2K. The second effort was by a fellow named Dr. Alessandro Comai, and he developed something called the world-class CI benchmarking model. So it should sound familiar to this question. That he did in conjunction with fellow Dr. John Prescott. And it has a series of 7 different categories, along with some sub-factors within those categories that you can compare commercial practice units to. So there are ways to do this, again, some of which are better than others, some of which you may be able to get the data on easier than others. But there are published examples of how to go about doing it and try to answer that question.
Yeah, let me add that you mentioned Jan Herring. Jan took that work a little bit further with another fellow, Judy Levitt, who she was working at Rockwell, and Jan was working on something that he called Herring's world-class characteristics. And those two were combined into a grid, which identified 3 sort of phases of the development of a CI function, sort of, beginner, intermediate, and professional, and the amount of time it might take to go from one phase to the next, and what sorts of activities would be going on at each phase, which don't necessarily happen always in that sequence. And that framework is a very useful way of looking at where you stand against a series of third-party standards, rather than looking at another company. It's also been used, I've seen it used as a means of the head of a CI group seeking additional resources from the management to show them this is where we were last year, And in order to get to this one next year, we need XYZ resources to progress further. So it has a practical purpose as well in terms of supporting the growth of a group.
Terrific. Thank you. Eric?
I have two kind of quick things to add. One is that in the late 1990s, one of my very first benchmarking assignments was benchmarking a semiconductor company's plan for building a competitive intelligence function against its peer group. And that's one of the things that kind of got me sucked into this world was, you know, boy, this is fun and cool, and people need this stuff. So I think there's some, to Cliff's point a second ago, there is some definitely valid order of magnitude uncertainty for how many people, budget, you know, what should they do? You know, what is that? Are we even in the right ballpark of how we're resourcing our intelligence function in comparison with our peer group? And what's the rationale for that resourcing? So that's number one. Number two, about 10 years ago, when Skip was trying to decide what to do with the CI Foundation, I happened to be the development committee chair of the CI Foundation as a trustee. And Cliff, you may remember, I know Craig remembers because we were just talking about it the other day, we developed a benchmarking offer for the CI Foundation, which was a donation that could be made to the foundation by a company to have two fellows come in and spend a day with their intelligence leadership and more anecdotally, sort of qualitatively, kind of go over what they're doing from a competitive intelligence point of view and what do their activities look like, what are they planning on doing next, et cetera. And we actually did one. I won't name any names here in terms of who was involved, but I was one of them, and I worked with somebody else on somebody else's program like that, and it resulted in a very successful $7,500 donation to the CI Foundation by this particular financial services company who shall remain nameless. But point is, what I learned from both of those exercises were there are details that can be used to benchmark rough orders of magnitude, but what really counts is when experience gets in and says, yeah, this is going to work for you, but boy, when I saw someone else do that the last time, that didn't work out the way they thought it was. And then the other person, the observer, say, yeah, but I saw another organization do it this way. Could you pivot that particular aspect of your operation this way and actually turn it into a productive, you know, source of value? So that wasn't very quick. I apologize. I thought those were going to be shorter.
It was worth it. Thank you. Yeah, and we have a follow up to this actually. So JP Radicek has asked that has commented that Cliff mentioned Herring's roadmap, and he recently used it, but he found that it was dated. So he's asking, is there anything newer that exists with perhaps a more appropriate focus on technology? Just curious. Yeah, and Craig, you actually did answer that here. You know, there are a few capability maturity models that are being used by PSFs in our field that do have a clear tech focus. Would you like to elaborate on that a bit for the audience? And you're muted.
Yeah, there are again, there are a couple of professional services firms that have been tracking. Doing their own surveys essentially over the last few years, some of which do get published and are made available publicly, that are being used to build upon, you know, Jan and Judy's kind of earlier efforts. They're out there. They're not hard to find. There's probably 3 of them that I'm familiar with. There's probably a few more out there, but at least there's 3 that I know that have been done over a multi-year period since about first of these came out right about the same time that Jan and Judy's publications on this came out in the mid 2000 range. So I would certainly encourage, JP or others that are interested in that, you can look for those. Recognize there are limitations and assumptions that are built into any of these applications, as well as some sampling issues that you want to take into account when you apply them to your own organization.
Mm-hmm. And with that, I'll just add too that we've adapted various models as well, and we've actually taken Jan and Judy's model, and actually one of the things we've done is to compress the time frame, because we find that the time frame now is actually a bit too broad for most of our applications. And so I think that it's very important for us to consider, that these models are not set in stone. And we do need to innovate, and we should innovate on our own insofar as we can. And communities like this is a wonderful way to begin. But certainly adapting existing models, maybe not all of the parts are suitable to your purpose, and you apply the tweaks that you need to. And I do encourage that, because I think this way you're not shoehorning something, right? You're yourself into a situation. You're really creating or applying tools that are more situationally and circumstantially appropriate.
By the way, Cynthia, this brings us back to something that Skip started back in the 80s. We used to do a survey of our membership, and we used to look at things like who we are and what we do. And for years, this was started. John Prescott was one of the co-originators of that. I actually jumped in on the second edition of that. It was one of my first publications, by the way, in the field. But that was done for about well into Y2K, and hasn't been done, to my knowledge, since I think 2006. Bonnie Hohoff was kind of the wrangler of the last of those big efforts. And that's something that I think, a group like the CI Fellows, would serve a very, very valuable role in. And let me give you the most practical example of how that was used. One of the things that we used to collect was salary data as well as job descriptions. And we had a big bank of job descriptions at Skip. I think at one point we had well over 500 or 600 job descriptions from the people that actually responded to our survey. And those were in file folders back at the office on Diagonal Road. I'll remember, because Bonnie used to, it was hard to stuff them all in there, just back in the paper day, of course. But more importantly, those salary surveys were really important, and it helped a lot of our colleagues out there in the field understand whether they were being valued at the level that they should have been relative to other people doing similar kinds of activities. Here again, even a salary study, something that I think would benefit many of us in the field if indeed somebody were to take the reins and move it forward.
Yeah, and Craig was there when we had our annual meeting last week, and we discussed embarking on some surveys. And so that would be that we do have surveys in the works, that would help us with benchmarking like this. And so stay tuned, folks.
I would like to provide a different perspective. In my industry, a lot of times we'll do work, and our leadership will ask us, well, how is Lockheed doing this? How is Raytheon doing this? How is L3 Harris doing this? And we don't benchmark. We would love to benchmark against them, but we have this, we don't talk to each other, and for good reason a lot of times, but it's just the culture of the aerospace defense industry that we don't want to share. We have what I call the underground informal network of former NG Northrop Grumman employees that I can call up, and we kind of informally talk around our processes, but we don't do that very well. So I go outside of our industry to find out, what are you all doing? What best practices are out there? And the problem I have with that is we're a very risk adverse industry. And for me to bring in something that I know it's going to work well to these folks, it's foreign to them. So it takes me a good 6 months to translate a process or terminology into something that doesn't scare my folks. So I'm constantly sneaking things slowly in the back door that I've learned about. And then somebody will say, what is that? That's really cool. Where did you get that? I'll mention to them, I'll say, this came from here, and this is what it looked like when I originally got it, but it doesn't look that way now, but it's the same outcome. So in my industry, if I said, hey, I want to go benchmark, it's just not going to happen, because they first want to look towards ourselves. And I keep saying, no. The processes, the procedures, the outcomes, they're all the same. It doesn't matter what industry you're in. If I'm going to do a Porter's 5 forces analysis, it's going to be the same everywhere. It's just going to be maybe slightly different focus. And so I have that difficulty with the culture. So I just wanted to add that.
There's one other group I wanted to mention that many of us have participated in over the years. It's run by the Conference Board, and it's called the Council on Competitive Analysis. I served as a member of it for about 10 years and chaired it for a while. And it basically was made up of the heads of intelligence among Fortune 500 companies in 25 different industries. And you were only allowed to have one representative per industry participate. And the best part of that was sort of cross-industry free consulting. Usually what would happen is someone would bring a case that they had been asked to work on by their management to the group that they had no clue as to how to start. And they would present that case, and the people would work in small groups to come up with suggestions. And then the person who came got ideas that he could bring back and apply immediately. Mm-hmm. So often learning from your peers outside your industry may be a tremendous way to benchmark, particularly if you can do it face to face.
Great, thanks, Cliff, and I want to thank Rich also for sharing your thoughts in the way you practice, because yes, I think you present a perspective that is important for those who are in similar situations. Yeah, and terrific. Thank you, Cliff. We have a question here from Yvonne, and Yvonne, I've actually unmuted you. So you can pose your question more completely via audio. Would you do that for us, please? Yeah, we're not picking up on your audio here. Let's see. Yeah, okay, sorry, I guess it's not.
Okay.
There we are.
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
Yeah, thanks for taking my question.
Well, thanks for asking. So would you pose it to the panel and share your thoughts with us?
Well, I'm just trying to see if there are any new insights into CI and the not-for-profit areas. If someone has run across studies or could recommend some studies.
Yeah, and you'd mentioned also in the Q&A panel that specifically you were looking at measuring success and ROI, right, in the not-for-profit area?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah. Any thoughts about that, or perhaps even adapting what we use in commercial for not-for-profit purposes?
Well, I'll go ahead and start that because again, there have been a couple of dissertations that have been written over the last 20 years that were focused at that intersection of competitive intelligence for not-for-profits. And there hasn't been a lot of work. So Yvonne, just to start off, I wish there was something kind of readily available we could turn you to. And I haven't seen any of that, by the way. Probably the most recent one I saw was in the early part of this decade. What I have seen, however, are a fair number of these applied to public agencies and government agencies. So where there wasn't at least a for-profit motive involved by a commercial enterprise. One of these was done by a fellow by the name of Dr. Nisha Sodas, who's in South Africa, and she actually looked at how one of the government departments in her home country of South Africa measured success there. And some of that was based on modifications of things that we do over in the in the commercial and for-profit side, including things like customer satisfaction. One of the things I know she found out, I was one of the chairs of her committee, was that they can even use things like net promoter scores to see where they kind of compare to other not-for-profits and whether your not-for-profit actually is able to generate better. But there's going to be a lot of noise in between what the CI people do in those not-for-profits and how the not-for-profits are actually evaluated or perceived by stakeholders. And that's almost always been the problem in doing kind of CI, ROI, or success measures for NFPs. And I don't know how you get around that easily, at least.
Okay. All right. Thank you. That's a good, that's a start. Okay.
Yes, and I do want to point out, and Craig, can also add to this too, that CI is also growing among higher ed. Higher ed, and not just in terms of folks who are teaching CI around the world, but higher ed is actually adopting competitive intelligence for management purposes. And so they have been adapting these practices, and granted, it's a lot easier to conduct CI when you are in environments like that are really already more sharing focused, and there's already a community culture of sharing. Right? So when you have higher ed institutions, publishing their their internal data, sharing, and internally as well as externally among other higher ed educational institutions, and we find that that this is so in most nonprofit sectors as well, because there's a collaborative aspect even among nonprofits who are competing, right, for funds or donor funds, or competing for mind share, which is a non-traditional form of competition, but it's still a very real one. So
that kind of goes into my next kind of question. I'm doing some research for a client on community development. Mm-hmm. I thought, perhaps CI has, gotten into that area as well.
Yeah, well, there's been a history of CI in economic development.
Right.
Okay.
And community development is rather new, but I would say, and I think Craig will agree with me, that there are a number of things you can borrow from economic development practices.
Okay.
And so I would look to various economic development organizations at the regional level, state levels in the United States anyway, and even internationally there are economic development organizations regionally. And you can look at some of those practices and adapt those, and that's a good fit. I also want to name drop another person, Rostik Hersky, who is one of our fellows, and he is he maybe works in a non-governmental sector in Saskatchewan, Canada, and he does this a lot, converting commercial practices into something that he can use to support his organization, as well as governmental organizations. And so I regret that he's not here. Sometimes he is, but it may be worth reaching out to him for some thoughts as well, and I think maybe we'll whisper in his ear.
Yes, could you type his name, please?
Yes, and let's see. Here we go. Yes, Craig's already on it. And Craig, do you want to add to this? Because I know you've been nodding.
Yeah, so I mean, Rostik and I have been working together on this for a number of years. He's not the only one doing it, obviously, but there have been a number of efforts. So Rostik's focus initially was on what we call research and technology organizations. So he was head of actually he built a CI group within the Saskatchewan province that was designed to help entrepreneurs and founders really learn how to take their business ideas or their intellectual property or their inventions into the marketplace. And he was, their job at the RTO that he was in charge of was to really try to enhance the success of entrepreneurial efforts and innovation there in the province. He's moved in the last couple of years over to the healthcare side of his province. Now he's trying to help healthcare and medical researchers actually apply CI. What you and I would call CI, Yvonne, but they're trying to figure out how do you apply CI to actually promote and improve the productivity, success, and outcomes of health and medical research that's done in the province. So he's very much on the leading edge in this. And the last thing I'll add, there are a number of countries, and I mean literally countries, where it's being done. Canada's one of those, but I think some of the world leaders would include places like Sweden and Finland, who have been doing this kind of effort, at the social and community level for a lot longer than most of us here in North America. Okay. And also, believe this or not, China is well ahead of the curve, I would argue, also trying to move that forward. So you may need to look a little further afield than just North America.
Okay, could you spell the gentleman's last name, please?
Oh, it's on the chat panel, Rostik Hersky. Craig.
I don't see it.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, let's see.
It's not on my screen anyway.
Oh, okay. Yeah, sorry about that. All right, so here we are. maybe that, hopefully that's gone through.
Got it. Okay. HURSHCKY.
Yeah, yeah, and so Rostig is our colleague, who's done a lot. There he is.
Okay.
So Craig's also posted his email address for those who are interested.
Okay.
But one of the things that I've done too in the academic instruction that I do is that I actually. Part of that instruction involves information scientists and folks who will be information professionals and librarians, and helping them understand how to use Intel. And so that's I think more aligned to your question. But we'll take tools like the 5 forces and adapt those for those purposes. And so obviously the nature of the competition is not the same as commercial. And so one of the exercises that I have students go through is to ask them how they would adapt this and looking at it from a value perspective. And so I would urge you to also take that approach as well for the nonprofit sector in adapting various tools that we tend to use in the commercial, because a lot of them do lend themselves well with some good tweaks.
Okay,
so,
good.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and Eric also has something to add as well. So let's turn to him.
Just real quickly, I'll try and be quick. A couple weeks ago, I did a superiority workshop with a startup around this thing called collective impact. And it's the first time I've heard of collective impact. I don't have any, I've led a sheltered life. But what this startup is doing is they're using big data to aggregate sources of data around outcomes of collective impact programs at the community level. In particular for benefactors like the United Way. So if the United Way has 100 different beneficiaries in front of it, it can't support them all. And so how to make choices about which of those beneficiaries to fund with an investment, I've learned they call them, in order to produce a more reliable outcome. And what these guys have done is they've used big data to create what is essentially a FICO score, a creditworthiness, metric around the reliability of the outcomes of a particular collective impact group movement, at the local level. So you may have, a cradle to workforce program in Saskatchewan, and another one in Atlanta, and another one in Boston, and another one in Madison, Wisconsin, and they may have radically different results. And if you're in the United Way up at the national level trying to figure out which one of those to fund, you can use this aggregate score as a way to tell you where to allocate your resources. Now, from the nonprofit side, that means that outcomes become really, really, really important. And I think that's a big part of what's going to happen in the nonprofit world competitively going forward. Just my instincts say, if you've got a metric like that, that's a single number, like if you have a 750 for your FICO score, you're considered a pretty good credit risk. If you've got a 550 for a FICO score, good luck getting an appointment with a banker. It's going to come to that at some point. And I think a lot of that basis of competition will be how you validate a potential investment to fund as benefactor. So just a thought for you on kind of the trend that a novice is seeing in the collective impact world, at least.
An excellent observation, novice.
Okay.
Thank you. Terrific. I hope we helped answer your question, Yvonne. Does it sound like the stuff you can use?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you. And for a topic in the future, I couldn't resist. There's a really good article on CI tools, all the software that's out there. Trying to give analysis. A quid, niche fire, and I'd like to see some of the fellows tackle some of this.
Yeah, could you type that into the chat box, Yvonne? Because
Sure.
you're cutting in and out a bit. Yeah, and in
Sure.
the interest of time. Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah,
Okay.
so we actually have another question here that I've got on the screen. that I think many people are struggling with, and one brave person actually asked this. So, so credit, to the asker, the questioner. CI can often be exhausting. There's always plenty of demand from CI from all levels of management and all parts of the organization. The need to scan, review, fire hose of different information sources, as well as pressure on ourselves to get it right. This all sounds like a perfect recipe for burnout. How do you avoid burning yourself out? So I'll turn this over to some of our seasoned fellows and who've probably have some really great advice here.
Greg says retire. I was going to say happy hour, but
how's that working for you, Kalb?
So
let me offer some thoughts on this one.
Yeah.
I think probably one of the ways of doing it, hopefully if you're at the beginning of your CI career, would be to sit with your management or your supposed definition of your group of customers and come to a decision around the scope of your work. What is it you do and what is it you don't do? And get that group of customers to sort of agree on what's inside your area of expertise and what falls outside of it. And that then becomes integrated into your job description. And once it's in your job description, your definition of what you do helps you to sort of eliminate things that might be considered the firefighting kind of work. One of the things that we did when I started my group at Merck was we ruled out anything that had to do with what is commonly known as data fetching and toting, which is usually the starting point for a group where you get a bunch of questions around, look this up, send it to me, and if you don't do it by lunchtime, you're no good. And we basically set up rules that said, unless there's analytical work associated with the project, or there is a decision associated with it, or some piece of intelligence or information which will support a decision, that's really outside the scope of what we do. Another thing that we did was we built a very strong network of in-house experts in a variety of other departments. So if you have a good head of the department who's taking in the assignments, they can serve as a filter. And that filter will serve to deflect questions where someone else in the company might be a better source, because you've got that definition of the scope of what it is that you do. For instance, if it's better done by finance, if it's better done by a library, if it's better done by somebody which really doesn't fit the description of what your CI department is supposed to do. And then I think on an ongoing basis, constantly check back with your customer group as to whether the service level is up to what is expected, and trimming it to what, I hate to say this because it sounds a bit elitist, but the kinds of projects that will really move the needle in the company. In other words, not just the ones that are associated with a small group of businesses or smaller portion of the business, but ones that can actually have a long-term strategic impact on the business. That may not happen right away. Takes time to be able to develop trust with people at say the C-suite level. But I would say the more you can focus on fewer, more important projects, the better off you will be, and the better your group will be recognized and will not burn yourself out.
Great
Just
advice.
some thoughts.
No, great thoughts, Cliff. And I just want to point to the chat panel as well, because Craig and Eric have also been sharing their thoughts about this. Would either of you like to elaborate on what you've shared so far in the chat panel?
Well, I'll just say that I think to be effective, as I've noticed this about me, as I've gotten older, 25 years ago when I first started out, I didn't really know what I was doing, so I had to work very hard to have any sort of impact at all. Now, I won't suggest that I know everything about how to do what I do, but I know how to turn on 100%, and And that has consequences, I've discovered, which is I need recovery time. If I'm going to be 100% for an hour, I kind of need 0% for an hour in order to get back to kind of my baseline and have that capacity again. When I was at 20%, I could go 18 hours a day. So a part of this is, as we mature as professionals, discovering our own highest calling. And I define that as, in the context of the organization and the people that you serve in that organization, what are their greatest needs, as Cliff alluded to earlier, and then focus in on just a couple, and then align that with your talents, and then be disciplined in outsourcing to others who have adjacent capabilities or talents of their own that can be force multipliers on whatever it is you are truly gifted at and can express your highest calling for. I think it's the only way to survive, candidly. And I think you and I all would probably agree that the average lifespan of a competitive intelligence person in corporate America is tragically short. And I think a lot of it is because, not necessarily of this burnout issue, it's because of the misalignment of talent with the highest calling or the client need.
Excellent. Thanks, Eric. And Craig, did you have any thoughts?
Yeah, just real quickly, I think what a lot of us are saying is we have to have a really clear understanding of that essential why question. Why are we doing this? Why is it important? Why do they need it? If we don't have answers to the why questions, we're going to have a really tough time avoiding stress and burnout.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you mentioned that. And you also mentioned too, for those there, we have a couple of folks on the phone. Craig mentioned scope creep, being a factor as well. And so that, is something that I want to mention, managing our projects well. And Cliff, you did a terrific job in underscoring the importance of doing this from day one of our jobs. I think too often people who come into a CI role are very enthusiastic, and we don't necessarily want to say no and set parameters because we just want to be of value. And I think that is a tricky, very tricky position to put ourselves in. And so I think we've received some terrific suggestions. There's just a couple of other maybe more tactical tips that I want to add too. When I served many different masters, when I was at a CI firm, we were supporting folks at the executive level, all the way to project managers, and that was a fire hose. And we were finding that it was very difficult to manage daily juggles, despite our best efforts. And these are highly organized people who are on my team. So I put up a whiteboard, and that whiteboard tracked all our projects. And so that when people popped in for some of these by the way questions, or even for projects, they got to see what was already on our panel, on our radar, what we were working on, what was in the pipelines, and so forth. And that surfaces the sheer volume of work that we had to do. It also surfaced the time frame in which we had to do it. And because we had kind colleagues, these folks looked at this board, and there was a lot of sympathy, and empathy brought into it. And they didn't place unreasonable demands. I needed it yesterday, or I need it by the end of today. Their requests were much more realistic. And so I think, by creating a dashboard, if you've got a distributed workforce in which you surface these things, they could be Gantt charts that you can share, these types of things, sharing your activities, that type of thing can help not only with the value ROI question, but also in helping people understand what you have on your plate and where they might fit in. And it has a self-organizing kind of effect as well. So try to think about these types of tools that can help you organize. And I just want to, again, underscore what my colleagues have shared. I think it's just really important for us to look at this from, a higher macro level as well. So, so we don't have time to get to question 5 because we're really just past the top of the hour now. So let's take a look. Let's move on to our LinkedIn group to answer that question. And so when we post the recording, I'm going to bring that question on. And we also have a host of other questions too that are on deck, and you'll see this in a second. But those questions we're going to be reserving for future thematic webinars. And so, please be on the lookout for those. Our next webinar will be November 20th. And so please join us for that. Just please note too, it is a week earlier than the final week simply because of the holiday in the United States. We have our Thanksgiving holiday there for those of you who are international. And but in the meantime, please stay in touch. If you want to follow and get a heads up on the on our webinars, the newsletter is the best way. So email acme@cifellows.com and you'll be the first to know when our next webinar registration is open. And please check out our recordings on our website. The path is there in orange. And join our Twitter feed as well as our CI community group on LinkedIn. So thank you, panelists, but thank you all for sharing your questions. We really deeply appreciate some very thoughtful questions and burning questions that you've shared with us. And to be continued. We'll do this thematically from here on out, rather than having these open Q&As, but that are general, but keep them coming. You can also share your questions at acme@cifellows.com so that we can queue them up. And as you register your questions, we'll also register what types of topics are important to you, and that's going to help shape the webinar topics to come as well. So thank you all very much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your week. Goodbye for now.